Here is a sentence a contemporary churchman actually wrote about a Visigothic king, with no hedge, no qualifier, no second thought. He was the first ruler in the whole history of this kingdom to hold every last piece of the Iberian Peninsula under one Gothic crown, something brought to none of the leaders before him. Read that again. Not one of the strongest kings. Not among the more successful. The first ever to unify the whole peninsula, full stop. No rival claim left standing anywhere on the map. The churchman riding it was Isidore of Seville, the same relentless encyclopedist this series has followed for 2 episodes now, and he was not being careful here. He was being triumphant, and the king he was writing about would be excommunicated, stripped of everything he owned, and exiled with his family within about a decade of that sentence being written. This is the story of how a reign that ended every foreign foothold on this peninsula still couldn't survive the one threat it had built into its own foundations. His name was Suintila. You'll also see it spelled Swinthila in places. Same king. This series will stick with the first, and his career is the closest thing Visigothic Spain ever produced to a total, unambiguous victory. It bought him almost nothing. Suintila did not arrive at the throne as an outsider gambling on a coup, and he did not inherit it by blood either. He arrived at it as a proven soldier. Under the previous king, the cultured, forceful Sisebut this series just spent an episode with, Suintila held the office of Duke, a Gothic military command, not a courtesy title, and Isidore credits him directly with subduing a Roman garrison, an early bite out of the same Byzantine enclave he would later finish off as king, and defeating a mountain people called the Vascones, the same people Sisebut's reign had already had to campaign against. In other words, by the time Suintila took the crown, sometime around the year 621, he had already spent years being the man Sisebut sent to fix the kingdom's hardest military problems. This series has now watched kings come to power through very different routes: a religious convert crowned by his father's court, a usurper backed by a foreign army, and now a career officer promoted in effect by his own record. The Visigothic crown, whatever else it was, kept being decided less by who you were born to and more by who could actually hold a battlefield. That pattern is about to matter enormously. There was one piece of unfinished business left over from Sisebut's reign, and it's the piece Suintila is remembered for finishing. A shrinking strip of southern Spain was still, after 7 decades, held by troops loyal to Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, what later history calls Byzantium, though Isidore never uses that word. He just calls it the Roman hand, as if the old empire's fingers were still gripping a few coastal cities on a peninsula it had otherwise lost completely. Sisebut had already pried loose several of those cities. Isidore's own account of Suintila's reign says simply that the new king obtained through engagement of battle the remaining cities that the Roman hand held in the Spanish lands. No place names, no named commander, just the fact of completion. It's later historians, working from other evidence, who supply the specific cities recovered across this 2-reign campaign: Cartagena, Malaga, Saguntum, and Macedonia, the last of them falling to Suintila by around 624. Isidore does give one vivid, oddly personal detail about how that last campaign actually closed. He writes that the cover of 2 patricians, senior Byzantine officials, increased Suintila's glory in the fighting, because Suintila won one of them over by prudence, meaning negotiation, or something bought, while the other he subjected to himself by the virtue of battle, meaning the man simply lost. Neither official gets a name in the text that survives. One empire's local governors, reduced to being split between a bought-off defector and a defeated prisoner, with not even Isidore bothering to record which was which. Put the 2 pieces together, and you get something Isidore himself states as flatly as a man can state anything. For the first time since Roman authority had first splintered on this peninsula generations earlier, there was no foreign garrison left standing anywhere on it. But Isidore's own history immediately undercuts its own triumphant claim, in the very same entry, without seeming to notice it was doing so. Early in his reign, Suintila also marched against the Vascones, mountain peoples in the western Pyrenean foothills who kept raiding the settled province below them. Isidore describes what happened next in language worth hearing closely. Struck by terror at his arrival, the Vascones laid down their weapons, submitted their necks in supplication, handed over hostages, and were put to work building a fortress town for their new overlords. One Isidore names Algidas, before promising to obey whatever they were commanded. That is not integration. That is coercion with excellent public relations. The Vascones weren't absorbed into the kingdom, the way the old Subic kingdom to the north had been a generation or so earlier. They were terrified into temporary compliance and set to forced labor as proof of it. So when Isidore calls Suintila the first king of a fully unified Hispania, the honest version of that claim has an asterisk sitting right next to it, supplied by Isidore's own pen a few lines later. Unified, if you count frightened submission as unity, and largely, this series would add on paper. There's a detail about Isidore's own book worth pausing on, because it explains why this entry reads so differently from almost everything that came before it. Isidore's history of the Gothic kings survives in two separate versions. The shorter one stops at Sisebut's death. The longer one, the one containing everything just described about Suintila, was finished during Suintila's own reign, in the middle years of his rule, and it's this same longer version that also contains Isidore's two most famous set pieces of pure celebration, a praise of Spain and a praise of the Goths, rhetorical showpieces about how blessed this land and this people had become. In other words, the most unreservedly triumphant chapter of this whole royal history was composed, while its subject was still alive, still reigning, and still very much in a position to notice how he'd been written about. Isidore had watched one king's religious policy up close and privately troubled himself over it in the very same book. He does not extend Suintila the same scrutiny. Whether that's simple honest admiration for a genuinely accomplished king, or something closer to a court scholar writing for his patron, the text itself never says. It just reads like triumph, cover to cover, without a single note of foreboding. And then, in that same unclouded passage, Isidore records something else, just as approvingly, that should have set off every alarm this series has been building since Athanagild first seized the crown generations back. Suintila's son, a boy named Riccimir, still a child by Isidore's own description, was taken up to share the realm and enjoys equal sovereignty with his father, Isidore's own words, and notice there isn't a trace of criticism in them, only admiration for how promising the boy already seemed. Set that sentence against everything this series has already established about how the Visigothic crown was supposed to work. Not by birth, but by choice, chosen, at least in theory, by the kingdom's assembled nobles and bishops, the same principle that would later be written into formal church law. A king quietly elevating his own son to equal formal kingship, with no election and no debate, was not a minor family arrangement. It was an attempt to convert an elective throne into a hereditary one, by simple royal decree, dressed up as fatherly pride. By most accounts, Riccimir had already been placed in charge of Toledo itself in the years just before, a child being groomed, step by step, for a throne nobody had actually voted to give him. The nobles who were supposed to have a voice in choosing the next king had just watched that voice get closed off in advance. The resentment that decision produced didn't stay quiet for long. Grievances reportedly piled up fast, land confiscated from disaffected nobles, property and privilege redistributed between nobility and clergy in ways the old elite resented, a hereditary succession scheme nobody with a vote had actually agreed to. This series has already told you how the explosion arrived. A rival governor raising rebellion with the direct military backing of a Frankish king from across the mountains. Gothic nobles reportedly paying for that help with a single golden dish, said to weigh 500 pounds. The rebels' forces taking the city of Zaragoza and deciding the whole contest almost at a stroke. What this series hadn't told you yet is who else abandoned Suintila in that collapse. His own brother Jaela, a general in his own right, reportedly deserted him during the rebellion. The king who had just unified an entire peninsula for the first time in Gothic history could not hold together his own family's loyalty long enough to survive one bad season. Riccimir, the son given equal sovereignty without an election, is reported to have died in that same collapse, at that same city, sharing in the fall as completely as he had once shared in the throne. What happened to Suintila afterward is where the record goes strangely, tellingly quiet. The council this series has already covered, the one convened by the very king who deposed him, presided over by the same Isidore who had once written that unqualified sentence of praise, is remembered as having formally condemned Suintila, forced to renounce his crown, excommunicated, stripped of every possession, sent into exile with whatever family still stood by him. None of the sources this series can verify spell out the exact charge in the council's own words, the way it does for some of the men he outmatched on the battlefield. In the text as it survives, that triumphant passage was never rewritten into a confession or a retraction. The condemnation came instead from the machinery of the council itself, the very institution this series watched being built specifically to punish exactly this kind of ambition. Scholars who have compared Isidore's two surviving versions of the history have argued that something close to a complete reversal happened here, not on the page about Suintila as it has come down to us, but in the surrounding political and legal record the same churchman went on to help produce. The praise stayed frozen in the book. The verdict moved on without it. Suintila's wife is named in later genealogical tradition, though no source this series could locate records what became of her after the exile beyond that general sentence, stripped, condemned, gone. Suintila's own death goes unrecorded with any confidence, sometime in the handful of years after his fall, by natural causes or otherwise, nobody troubled to write down which. Compare that silence to Sisebut, whose death at least earned three competing rumors worth arguing about. Suintila, the most complete conqueror this kingdom had ever produced, didn't even get a rumor. Step back and look at the whole shape of this reign. A duke who earned a crown through genuine battlefield success. A king who finished off the last foreign garrison this peninsula had endured for 7 decades, and forced a stubborn mountain people into submission besides. A ruler flattered in his own lifetime by the greatest scholar of the age, in the most triumphant royal portrait that scholar ever wrote. And then, within roughly a decade of that sentence being composed, a family scattered, a son dead, a brother gone over to the other side, and a king erased from power so completely that history couldn't even be bothered to record how he died. The elective system this series has been tracking since the very first episode was supposed to protect the kingdom from bad kings by making them removable. What Suintila's fall actually proves is something colder. That system offered no protection whatsoever to a good king, or even a spectacular one. The moment his own ambition, or his own sons, gave the nobility a reason to use the mechanism against him. A crown with no fixed rule of succession doesn't just invite tyrants to be overthrown. It invites everyone, eventually, including the men who unified an entire peninsula, to find out exactly how temporary that unification really was. Whether the kingdom can survive another round of that same lesson, played out even more violently, is where this series turns next in the Visigoths Part 9, Wamba and the Crisis of Kingship.